There are different methods of naming skeletal muscles, which are all used. So the next few slides here, we're going to go through all of those different ways which we name skeletal muscles. For example, muscles could be named according to their location. And just think about the skeletal system when we went through all the bones, except instead of the name of that bone, we use a different ending, usually an IS or US. For example, we can see the fibula, which is a lower leg bone, while the muscle that sits over the fibula is called fibularis. We'll also see tibialis or temporalis or frontalis. These are muscles named after bones for which they lie on. Sometimes muscles are named according to shape. For example, this is a triangle-shaped muscle. We call it the deltoid. It's the shoulder muscle. Deltoid means triangle. You might have heard of trapezius, which is a trapezoid shape. Third way is muscle size. For example, the gluteal muscles, right, in the back of the hip area. There's a maximus, medius, and minimus, for example, where maximus is the largest of a group, minimus is the smallest of a group. And sometimes two muscles will lie side by side, performing the same action. Well, the longer one would be called a longus muscle, and the shorter one, it doesn't say here, is brevis. Brevis means short, longus means long. And another way, a fourth way to name muscles, is the direction of the fibers or fascicles. When you look at muscles, you can see strands running in a specific direction here on an angle. Here we can see them running up and down. It's like a grain, right? Those are the fascicles. Rectus means straight up and down. Oblique means at an angle. Transverse or transversus means horizontal. Often we see these terms referring to direction of fibers. Sometimes the number of origins play a role in the naming of a skeletal muscle. Remember when we say origins, if we're looking at a muscle, at one end there'll be one or more tendons. In this case there's two. At the other end, what you can't see here, there'll be an insertion. And when this muscle shortens or contracts, the insertion gets pulled up towards the origin. This muscle happens to have two origins. You can see two tendons. We call it biceps muscle, bi meaning two, and in this case two origins. There's also a triceps muscle that's not shown here that would have three origins. Here's another way to name a muscle, location of attachments. So in this case we have a muscle with two origins, one on the sternum, one on the clavicle, and one insertion on the mastoid process. This muscle name happens to be sternocleidomastoid, based on its three attachments: onto the sternum, sterno, onto the clavicle, another origin. Cleido happens to be the word root for clavicle, believe it or not, and then its insertion on the mastoid process, and there's your mastoid. So big long name, but it makes sense if you just look at all three attachment points. Best way, I think, to name a muscle is by its action. And we're going to be going through lots of muscles and learning their actions. Well, you don't have to learn their actions sometimes if the action is in the name. For example, an example is a flexor muscle. Well, flex is a specific joint. For example, flexor carpi. Doesn't say carpi here, but a flexor carpi. Well, we know carpals are wrist bones, so a flexor carpi muscle will flex the wrist. An extensor muscle, let's say extensor carpi, for example, well, that would extend the wrist. And sometimes, as it says down here, is that more than one criteria can be used at the same time. So look at this big long name for a muscle: extensor carpi radialis longus. Well, that tells us a whole lot. It tells us it extends the wrist. Extensor carpi. That muscle happens to be on the radius side, which is the lateral side of the forearm, because the ulna is on the other side. So extensor carpi, it's on the radial side, radialis, and there must be more than one, a short and a long muscle that performs the same function. This one happens to be the long one, longus. So there would also be a brevis, brevis meaning short. All right, we look at muscles and we see their fascicles, right? We see their arrangement. They can be arranged in a lot of different ways. I'm going to go through these slides a little quickly because I'll slow down after we go through all the arrangements because that's where the point is made. But if muscles are arranged in a circle like this, like around the mouth, it's called orbicularis oris. We have circular muscles around the eyes, so it would be orbicularis oculi. That's fine. When these muscles contract, they close something, right? Convergent muscles have a very wide origin, but all of these fascicles converge to one point, so we have a very narrow insertion, like, for example, the pectoralis major here. Go to the next slide. Parallel muscles. You see, parallel muscles are very long. Not a whole lot of fascicles there, just a handful of fascicles, but very long muscles like the sartorius that crosses the hip joint and the knee joint. Can't really see it crossing the knee joint, it's a little bit hidden there. Fusiform muscles like the biceps brachii are narrow at each end and wider in the middle. And then we have pennate muscles. Pennate means feather, and if you look at them, they kind of look like feathers with all these fascicles, these short little fascicles around a central tendon. In this case, there's more than one central tendon, multi-pennate. There could be just one tendon with one row of short little fascicles. That's unipennate. Here's a central tendon with fascicles on either end. That one really looks like the feather, right? Bipennate. These are really strong muscles, and I'm going to explain that on the next slide. For this concept right here, I'm going to take the two extremes. So we went through all those arrangements of fascicles, and at one extreme we have a parallel muscle like the sartorius that we saw, which is long, real long, but not a whole lot of fascicles. If we look at it, there might be just a few fascicles in this muscle. At the other extreme, we have very short fascicles, but there's a lot of them, right? Not many and long, short and many. So these two muscles will have very different properties. So let's use the long fibers first, like this one right here. Since it's long, it'll have a very large range of motion, which means a lot of movement at the joint that it works at. There you see a large range of motion, but since there's not many fascicles, they're usually not powerful. So these are weaker muscles, but perform a lot of movement. At the other extreme here, we have a lot of fascicles, right? So this is going to be an extremely strong muscle, very powerful muscle. But since the fascicles are short, well, they can only shorten so much. So a pennate type of muscle will shorten very little. It'll have a very small range of motion, but it will be powerful. So those are the two different properties muscles can have based on their arrangements, with all the other ones kind of falling in between.